Thank you once again for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. It's our first live show. This is going to be brought to you, as always, by GSMC Sports Network. And once again, I am your host, Matthew Quinn. We have a great show for you today. We'll be covering the ongoing situation, ongoing news in free agency over the past day or so. Hasn't been as busy as it's been, over the past couple of days. Today was kind of a slow day, but there were still some moves to talk about, so we're going to get into that. Also, we're going to do a little bit of a player comparison between two of the most polarizing free agents that are still out there in Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson. And also we'll be getting into some season outlooks as well. So make sure you stick around for later in the show. I'm going to be giving you my list of a handful of teams that I came up with that I believe are currently losing in free agency right now. So before I start, I just want to ask you guys that you like and follow the show as always. Any sort of information or comments, questions, anything like that is all greatly appreciated. We do appreciate everything that you guys say. So if you've got a question during the show, we do want to hear it. Your input is a big part of what makes this show great. So we do thrive on your insights and your energy. Whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you do want to make sure that your message stands out and that it absolutely gets read, there's an easy way to do that. Use the super chat feature. Just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we appreciate every single bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. And if you prefer, you can also go to GSMCsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support. So we're so thankful to have you as part of our community. And once again, that link is GSMCpodcast.net. And let's go ahead and get into our first segment of the day. We're going to be covering some of the free agency news that has happened over the past few days. One of the bigger stories over the past couple of days in terms of free agency has, of course, been situations with Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson. Now, nothing has happened right now as we speak, as we're recording this. But there are, some talks going on with the Giants and with the Steelers. They're not sure exactly, what's going to go on. There's leaks saying that one team is favoring Rodgers, other team is favoring Russell Wilson. Even the Titans are in that mix too, as having talked to Russell Wilson, but nothing has come of that so far. As far as what has happened today, we had a couple of things. Some of the smaller contracts. Daniel Jones commits to the Minnesota Vikings he was from the Minnesota Vikings, commits to the Colts for 1 year, $14 million. And they are apparently going to be having a, quarterback competition with those two guys, Anthony Richardson and, of course, Daniel Jones now in the mix. Jimmy Garoppolo is returning to the Rams as well for a 1 year, $11 million deal. That's just basically backing up Matthew Stafford. He's been there for a year now, so not a huge deal there. Zach Wilson, another backup quarterback that was signed by the Dolphins, just to back up Tua. And he may get some playing time because Tua has that history of, being hurt a lot with his concussions that he's had multiple times over the past few years. The Cowboys made a move. The Cowboys have not really been a player in free agency to this point, but they did sign from Denver Javonte Williams on a 1 year, $3 million contract. They needed help at the running back position. Javonte Williams didn't have necessarily the greatest year for Denver last year, but he signs with the Cowboys for the 1 year. Not a whole lot of money, so it's not a ton of risk. But the Cowboys, of course, don't have a ton of cap space either. I still think they could address running back in the draft. That's a whole other conversation when we get closer into the draft and all kinds of draft talk and all that. But they signed Javonte Williams. For now, we'll see if they go draft a guy and have it be sort of like a 1-2 punch sort of thing until the main running back gets, acclimated to the system. But, a lot of teams go multiple running backs or running back by committee nowadays. So, could happen there. Relatively well-known name that a lot of people kind of forgot about because, he's kind of up there in age, but he has a new home, and that is DeAndre Hopkins signing with the Baltimore Ravens for 1 year and $5 million. Obviously, Hopkins was on the Chiefs last year, played in that Super Bowl, had a very costly drop in that game that could have, at least gotten a little bit of momentum on the Chiefs side, with a big play there. They most likely still wouldn't have won that game, but Hopkins signs with the Ravens. Don't know how much, production you're going to get out of him. He didn't do a whole lot with the Chiefs as a whole last year, but he still does have the ability to make some pretty incredible catches from time to time. Not the number one receiver that you're used to seeing, like when he was in Houston. He's not quite that guy anymore. But that comes with age, and the Ravens needed some depth at the receiver position, so, why not sign a guy that has experience and has shown that he can be effective in the past? So pretty safe move there for the Ravens on only a 1 year, $5 million deal. Getting into some of the bigger news stories today, Leonard Floyd, who was with San Francisco for a number of years, they actually released him today, and not too long after that, the Falcons went ahead and scooped him up for a 1 year, $10 million deal. That will improve their defense, of course, but the Niners, of course, felt necessary to let him go to, get some more cap space. They could be moving some cap room around to potentially go after Joey Bosa, like has been rumored a lot. So maybe that was a move that they felt like they had to make at that point. Javon Hargrave, another guy that's kind of forgotten, he was also with the 49ers. He signs with the Vikings. There were multiple teams that were interested. The Steelers were one of them that reached out, but he ultimately signs with the Vikings and gets added to an already very good Vikings defense. So that is a good move for Hargrave there. One of the other moves that kind of affects, my favorite team, the Steelers, and that's a Landon Roberts signing with the Vegas Raiders on a 1 year, $3 million deal. He was a pretty solid linebacker for the Steelers, and the Steelers did sign a linebacker from Baltimore, Malik Harrison, earlier today too, to, I guess, sort of replace a Landon Roberts, but honestly, I feel like it's a bit of a downgrade. Landon Roberts has been very good against the run in Pittsburgh, so the Raiders definitely need a player like that, so it's a good move for them, but just another one in the list of, reportedly growing list of kind of errors that the Steelers have made, in my eyes anyway, over the past 24 to 48 hours. Roberts was a good player, and, I really would have liked them to hold on to him, but he moves on to the Raiders. Big news, one of the bigger news stories of the day is Grady Jarrett getting traded, and after his Falcons release, he gets traded to the Bears, and that's 3 years, $43.5 million for Grady Jarrett. And just to talk about the Bears just for a second, what they're doing in free agency right now and just in the offseason in general has been really, really impressive. They have beefed up that offensive line, basically completely redid the offensive line, and now they're going to turn their attention to their defense with Grady Jarrett with a big signing there to plug up the middle of that defensive line. It's a big signing, very smart signing. The Bears are doing what they need to do to make sure that their team takes a step forward, and that's building through the trenches. The offensive line was an issue last year. They've completely retooled that, and hopefully will have better protection for Caleb Williams this year, especially with the new head coach, the offensive-minded Ben Johnson. Everybody's excited to see what kind of offense he comes out with in his first year as head coach. And getting that offensive line up to speed and getting some really good players on there is definitely one of the first steps that you have to make. And now they're turning their attention to the defensive line. And they could still go after somebody in the draft, too, as we all know, since we've talked about it plenty of times, is that the defensive line class this year in the draft is very, very deep and very good. So you can get somebody even on the second or third day and probably can still be a pretty big contributor to you, if not a full-time starter. It's just that kind of defensive line draft class. So definitely a good move for the Bears. They are definitely up there. I'd probably say is the number one winner of free agency so far is the Chicago Bears. They're not making super flashy deals. The Grady Jarrett one was, I guess, pretty flashy just because he's a pretty well-known player. But for the most part, they're making solid decisions to bolster that whole team, especially that offense. So it's going to be a really exciting year if you're a Bears fan, I believe. Another one that kind of surprised me that I heard was C.J. Gardner-Johnson being traded to the Texans. The Eagles, we're going to talk about the Eagles in our final segment, but the Eagles have lost a lot of players on defense already in the early going of free agency. Free agency, of course, doesn't officially start until tomorrow at 4 p.m. when the new league year starts. So, there's a lot of time left, and, the Eagles could, of course, replace these players that they've lost through, more free agency acquisitions or some draft picks. But C.J. Gardner-Johnson, definitely one of the key pieces to that defense last year on that Super Bowl run. And now he is going to be with the Texans. So big upgrade for the Texans, for sure. One of the few good moves the Texans have made to this point. But that's a big loss for the Eagles. No matter how good their team still is, and it still is very, very good. Just because they've lost a couple of these players on defense doesn't mean that they're still not a very good team. They don't have some of the real big playmakers that they had on defense already, and there's still plenty of time for them to, replace those guys as best they can. But C.J. Gardner-Johnson, definitely a big loss for the Eagles there. Byron Murphy, who was one of the top free agent corners, he ends up re-signing with the Vikings on a 3-year, $66 million deal. So there was talk that he could potentially be going somewhere else, but the Vikings, as they've been making a lot of moves here over the past few days, they make a very good one in re-signing Byron Murphy and keeping that defense as solid as they have been. The Patriots made a couple moves as well. They went and they got Carlton Davis, 3 years, $60 million deal for that. He leaves the Detroit Lions, of course, and the Lions, leaves the Lions with a little bit of a hole. Of course, the Lions have done what they needed to do to try and replace that so far. They will probably get into the draft as well, looking to try and bolster that secondary some more with the departure of Carlton Davis. Javon Holland was the guy that got everything kick-started for us today. He signs with the New York Giants, another top defensive back, and it's a 3-year, $45 million deal for Javon Holland. He comes over from the Dolphins, and he should fit right into that defense that is, actually not that bad. You take a look at some of the Giants overall, they get a lot of slack because they're not necessarily the greatest in terms of offensively because they don't have, any answers as of yet at the quarterback position, but they've got some good players on defense, so this just adds to it. So that's a good move for the Giants there. 3 years, $45.5 million. That's pretty much what you expect to pay for a guy like that. Cameron Bynum, another guy, he goes to the Colts on a 4-year, $60 million deal. They shore up their secondary as well. Another move that I briefly touched on, and I'm going to touch on a little bit more in our later segment when we talk about the Broncos, but Talanoa Hufanga, the safety from 49ers, he signed a 3-year, $45 million deal to go to the Denver Broncos, and that bolsters that defense that was already pretty strong. So, with Patrick Surtain already there, now you got Hufanga, at very talented safety. He has had a couple of injury issues in the past year or so, but if he's healthy, he's a very good addition to that Broncos secondary. And just to end it all out, Justin Reed from the Chiefs, he decides to sign with the New Orleans Saints. That's a 3-year, $31.5 million deal there. Good job for the Saints. They're bolstering that secondary. They don't have a ton of cap space. They've got kind of a cap nightmare leading into this offseason. There's not a whole lot going on in terms of, hope or positivity with the Saints. They're kind of a mess in their rebuilding phase as they have questions basically all over the place, but they at least sign a veteran safety like Justin Reed, and they get they get a good player out of it. And they also re-signed Tyrann Mathieu today as well, just before we started this stream here. So they are doing their due diligence to try and shore up the defense in terms of some depth on the secondary. Matthew, not quite what he used to be, but still a quality player for them. So so that go ahead and covers it for the free agency portion of our show. Obviously it's gonna be hard not to, talk free agency for most of the show because everything that's been going on lately. So as of right now, that will do it for our first segment, and we will be right back after this, and we are going to get a little bit more into two players, Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson, and get into some comparisons between those two guys. All right, so just stick around. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
All right, guys, welcome on back to our first live show, the GSMC Football Podcast, brought to you by GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the show, just want to remind you guys that if you have any questions or comments and you'd like to contribute to the show, go ahead and hit the super chat and type in your comment or your question, and we will get to it as soon as I see it. So any sort of tips, donations, any kind of support at all is greatly appreciated. Again, that is gsmcsports.net if you want to type in your super chat, or you can go down in the comments on YouTube and type in a comment there, and I will try to get to it as soon as I see it. So with that, let's go ahead and get into our second segment of the day, and we're going to be talking a little bit about two of the most polarizing quarterbacks that are left in free agency right now. A lot of people talking about what these two guys are going to do, and that is Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers. Both guys have been linked to two teams mainly, and that is, of course, the Steelers and the New York Giants. I just wanted to kind of get into a little bit of what each player would bring to whatever team that he decides to go to. Obviously, the Steelers know, for the most part, what they're getting with Russell Wilson. And Aaron Rodgers, there's question marks around him, with the Achilles injury that he suffered a couple years ago. Bounced back this past year, had decent numbers, but they may be a little bit inflated just due to the fact that the Jets were playing behind in a lot of games last year. So running the ball wasn't necessarily an option at a lot of points of the game that they were in. So I just wanted to go through a couple of things here. The last 3 seasons, I did some research here. The last 3 seasons of each team, and keep in mind, I am not adding the year in which Rodgers was out after the first 4 plays of the season, because obviously he basically didn't play in that game. He, I think, threw 1 pass and it was incomplete or something like that. So not going to include that in the stats. These are just over the last 3 seasons that each of these guys have actually played in. And, of course, this goes back with Aaron Rodgers last year, his first full season with the Jets, and then the previous 2 years in 2022 and then in 2021 when he was in his last couple years with the Green Bay Packers. Russell Wilson, first year with the Steelers last year. He, of course, before that was in Denver for 2 years. He did improve in that final year in Denver from the first year he was there, which was basically a nightmare. But he has, he improved, but didn't really see a ton of improvement from that last Denver year to the first Pittsburgh year. But of course, he didn't play in as many games with the Steelers as he came in after the Steelers were already 4-2. So he missed 6 games due to that calf injury. But he still played most of the year. So just taking a look at the comparison, 2024 is not necessarily a fair comparison, like I said, because Aaron Rodgers played in 6 more games than Russell Wilson did. But overall, Aaron Rodgers had a 63% completion percentage, had just under 4,000 yards passing, 28 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, with a passer rating of 90.5. You compare that to Russell Wilson, just about the same completion percentage, 63.7%. He had about 1,400 less passing yards just due to the fact that he was injured the first 6 weeks. He had 2,482 yards, 16 touchdowns, and only 5 interceptions. He did have a couple fumbles as well, but overall his passer rating was 95.6. So a smaller sample size there. So Russell Wilson's numbers are probably going to look a little bit better if you factor in the 6 games that he missed. If he plays in those games, possibly he has better numbers than Aaron Rodgers, or it's possible that they could have pretty similar numbers, So both of these guys kind of had similar seasons overall. They had some spots where they actually played pretty well, but for the most part, they weren't able to really take the teams that they were quarterbacking to the next level. And there were, of course, a lot of underlying issues with both of these guys. Aaron Rodgers playing on the Jets. A lot of other things come along with playing with the Jets, a lot more spotlight. It's a big market in New York. And, of course, Aaron Rodgers is a very polarizing athlete. Everywhere he goes, people talk about him all the time. He's just one of those guys. If you take a look at just the difference overall, if you take a look at the teams that they are potentially going to, Steelers, Giants, both teams need quarterbacks, of course. Taking a look at the Steelers' perspective, if you want to go between Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers, I would personally go Russell Wilson, just simply because of the fact that he has been in this system for a year already. The Steelers wouldn't necessarily have to change too much offensively in terms of scheme to acclimate to Russell Wilson because he was been in that system last year. If they were to go after Aaron Rodgers, that is not only with all the other things that come along with having Aaron Rodgers, but you have to also think he's not necessarily the same type of quarterback that Russell Wilson is. Russell Wilson is more of a pocket passer now than he has been in the past, but he can still move and get outside the pocket. He may not be the fastest guy or faster than he once was, but he can still get out the pocket. Aaron Rodgers, especially coming off that Achilles injury that he had a couple years ago, he showed last year that he can't move like he used to. He's pretty much for the most part a statue back there. So that means he needs to have a very good offensive line, and the Steelers don't have that right now. To be fair, the Giants don't necessarily have a great offensive line either, but the way the Steelers offense is, especially with Arthur Smith coming into his second year as offensive coordinator, he's just begun to kind of put his name on the offense. And then if you want to bring in Aaron Rodgers, he's going to essentially have to throw out a lot of the work that he's done already and kind of start from scratch, because Aaron Rodgers, he's one of those guys that is going to want to do his own thing at times, call audibles and, things like that, check out of plays, all that. And just the type of player that he is, they need to readjust how they do it. I feel like they would need to adjust more to like a West Coast type of offense. Shotgun, stand in the pocket, hit the deep shots to DK and George Pickens. That would be kind of your offense, and maybe run some slants here and there across the middle, which is something that Russell Wilson doesn't really ever do in terms of just, getting rid of the ball quickly and throwing over the middle of the field. So those are two kind of negatives when you take a look at the Steelers side of the ball. For the Giants, they have a couple of weapons. They don't have a ton of anything really on offense. Malik Neighbors is a very, very good receiver, of course. Darius Slayton did re-sign, so they do have at least some depth there. You got to figure they're probably going to add another piece, wide receiver wise. depending on what they do at quarterback, they could end up foregoing both of these guys and drafting a quarterback for all we know. I know there's been talk of them potentially moving up to that first pick where the Titans are. Don't know if anything will actually happen with that, but it has been rumored a lot. But I think the Giants could benefit with really either of these guys. I think Russell Wilson can adapt to whatever system they want to run, and I feel like Aaron Rodgers would fit in there just because he wouldn't have to, move out of state. He would be an easy transition. He could get in there and he could, basically start from scratch, and, he would definitely elevate that team. They may not be necessarily, great, but they would probably be better than what the Jets were last year, because the Jets were pretty bad last year overall. There were a lot of other issues with the Jets, of course. But the Giants, they have their own issues too. And both Brian Daboll and Joe Shine, the GM, both of those guys are most likely coaching and, managing for their jobs this year. I don't expect that they will be kept on if this season kind of goes the way it has been going. And that could be a reason why they want to go after a guy like Aaron Rodgers, because he is older, of course. And that's the other thing that plays into, the argument between Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson is Aaron Rodgers is a good 3-4 years older than Russell Wilson. So if you're signing Aaron Rodgers, that's not a future, and neither is the Russell Wilson signing. Either one of these guys, no matter where they sign, they're not the future at any franchise that they sign to. They're just, they're on the back end of their careers. Aaron Rodgers probably has a better overall arm in terms of being able to, check out of plays, quick throws, things like that, getting guys open. But Russell Wilson has a better deep ball, I believe. And with the Steelers, I feel like that's a better fit, not only because he's been in the system before, but the Steelers just added DK Metcalf, who Russell Wilson is very familiar with when they played together in Seattle. So he's familiar with the kind of player that he is. Russell Wilson is very good at the deep ball, even still. He has a lot of other shortcomings, but as of right now, he's still a pretty good deep ball thrower. So I think Russell Wilson is a better fit, of course, than Aaron Rodgers, but we'll have to see what happens. It seems like it's leaning heavier into Aaron Rodgers as far as the Steelers are concerned, but we'll have to see. I would imagine that probably we'll get some news about that tomorrow when the new league year starts. I feel like that is going to be a pretty busy day tomorrow with teams trying to finalize their signings and, of course, announcing signings that maybe they haven't announced yet because they're waiting on the new league year to start. So a lot of things can happen between these two guys. They have a lot of similar traits, similar things about them. Both of them are aging quarterbacks who have Super Bowl experience and are looking for new teams and have shown that they have at least a little bit left in the tank. With Russell Wilson, he had some moments where he played pretty well for the Steelers before it, eventually kind of fell apart there at the end. Aaron Rodgers was pretty consistent as far as stats are concerned. He had a better stat output than Russell Wilson did. So he still has that ability, still got the arm strength and the arm talent. That's still there. It's just everything else that comes with Aaron Rodgers, the drama and all of, the baggage that comes with having Aaron Rodgers that could kind of turn some teams off of him. So we'll see what happens between those guys. I'm sure we'll get some news tomorrow. That's what I'm expecting anyway. So that's it for the comparison between those two guys. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about our ongoing season outlook series. We're going to be finishing off the AFC in general. We're going to be talking about the Las Vegas Raiders in the next segment. And then following that, we'll be talking about the Broncos and what they need to do and what they did last year, of course. So just stick with us. We will be right back right after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to our third segment of the day. We are going to be doing our ongoing series of season outlooks. We are finishing off the AFC as a whole today. We're going to be finishing off the last two teams of the AFC West, starting, of course, with the Las Vegas Raiders. Take a look at what they did last year. They went 4-13, finished fourth in the AFC West. Not where they wanted to be, of course, but they had a lot of issues, and they weren't necessarily a super strong team last year anyway. Having Antonio Pierce as their head coach last year, he is gone. So they have a new regime now. And take a look at what they did last year. 13th in passing yards, so they weren't terrible there. They were pretty much middle of the pack when they had two different quarterbacks basically that they were cycling through, and that was Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. They did have Desmond Ridder come in and play a couple of series, made a couple of plays here and there, but he obviously is not, the guy that you want starting as your starting quarterback. But yeah, so the Raiders, they have a lot of moves that they need to make. Of course, they did lose Nate Hobbs, one of their best defensive players. They lost him to the Packers. He signed as a free agent there. I know we talked about that a little bit, but that's a big loss for the Raiders. They did strengthen their defensive depth in the linebacker position. Inside linebacker in Landon Roberts signed from Pittsburgh. They signed him to a 3-year deal. So a good move for the Raiders there, as Roberts is a good run stuffer. So they definitely need some more help as well, though, because their best receiver on offense last year was a tight end, and that was Brock Bowers. Rookie Brock Bowers had an incredible year, and there was even talk that he could have ended up being Offensive Player of the Year or Offensive Rookie of the Year at least. But that obviously didn't end up going to him. So, Bo Nix was definitely really, really good in that same division too. He was another rookie. But, of course, it's hard to really beat out Jaden Daniels for that Offensive Rookie of the Year as the year that he had, getting to the NFC Championship game and all that. But the Raiders did make a couple of moves, though. The biggest one of note is, of course, trading for Geno Smith. So they will no longer have the quarterback tandem of Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. They actually have a quarterback that has shown that he has had some pretty decent success in Seattle, went to the playoffs a couple times. His career kind of started out on the negative side, drafted by the Jets, and nothing really went well when he was there. He got into a little bit of a fight in the locker room as well, ended up breaking his jaw. You remember all that nonsense that happened. So it was a tough start to his career, and then he gets a second chance when he goes and has Pete Carroll as his head coach, which, funny enough, is who he has as his head coach again now, as Pete Carroll signed in the offseason to coach the Raiders. But having Geno Smith back there, especially with Pete Carroll there, a guy that is familiar with him and knows how to use him and knows how to get the best out of him. So the Raiders will be better at the quarterback position at the very least. The talk was earlier in the offseason that they might have drafted Shedeur Sanders out of Colorado. Doesn't look like that's going to be the case anymore. I think that maybe they go running back as they need running back desperately, because their leading rusher last year was Alexander Madison, and he only had about 420 yards. And if that's your leading rusher, you definitely need some help in the offseason shoring up that position. And what a draft to do it. Plenty of guys out there that they can go get. And picking high in the draft like they are, there's been talk that maybe they go after Ashton Genty, the best running back that's available in the draft. Whether or not he's still there, we don't know what's going to happen on draft night. Could be trades that teams want to move up. Anything can happen. But if Ashton Genty is there, would not surprise me if the Raiders go after him because they desperately need some running back help. I actually thought that they might land Najee Harris, but he ends up going to the Chargers just because Najee Harris is from, that area. But so he has ties, to the Raiders as a fan growing up. So maybe he could have went there, but he ends up going to the Chargers. So the Raiders miss out on that. So their best bet in terms of finding a running back is the draft because there's not really anybody free agency wise that's really out there that can be, your starter going forward. Best bet is just to go into the draft and draft a guy like Ashton Genty or maybe Amarian Hampton if they can't get Genty with that first pick. A lot of other issues that they have that they need to fill, though, with wide receiver, big-time need there. There's a couple guys that could go there. Cooper Kupp has been talked about a lot. The Rams looking like they're probably going to release Kupp since they haven't been able to get a trade partner with him. So with him being a free agent, maybe the Raiders go after him and maybe get him on the cheap. Stephon Diggs is also still out there. Don't rule out an Amari Cooper reunion with the Raiders too. Of course, Amari Cooper started his career with the Oakland Raiders, and a lot of change has happened with the Raiders since Cooper left. He ended up going to Dallas, then he went to Cleveland, and then ultimately ended up with the Bills last year for a few games. He's a free agent. That could be a potential fit there, especially with an experienced head coach like Pete Carroll. He can probably get the most out of a player like that, even though he's still kind of up there in age, as he's closing in on the end of his career. Still could be effective if they go ahead and sign him. Either of those guys would be, ideal. There are a couple of receivers that maybe they could consider drafting, but there's a lot of other needs on this team. I don't expect them to go wide receiver with that first pick that they have. So maybe they go free agency. And that is a kind of a well that's sort of drying up at this point. So if they're going to sign a receiver in free agency, I would expect them to do it pretty soon, maybe even tomorrow when the new league year starts. When everybody can actually officially be released from the teams that are planning to release some of these players. So Raiders could go after some receivers, there. They could, go ahead and get some defensive help too, maybe some offensive line help as well. Not a whole lot really out there free agency-wise. They can go after somebody in the draft, I would imagine, or, maybe come up with a trade. Those are always a possibility. You never really know what can happen in the off-season. Anything can really happen. Not a lot of people were expecting that Saquon Barkley would sign that deal with the Eagles, and actually today is the one-year anniversary of that. Nobody thought that the Giants were going to allow one of their best or the best player on their team, franchise player, go to a division rival, but lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, we all know what happened after that. Over 2,000 yards and one Super Bowl and Offensive Player of the Year award later, and the Giants are looking pretty bad in terms of that. But that's just an example of, anything that can possibly happen in the offseason could happen. So just another thing to really think about. I don't think, like I said, I don't think they go after Shedeur Sanders anymore. Maybe they sign a guy, or maybe they go after somebody in the draft in day 3. There's a couple guys there. Tyler Shock is kind of an older rookie quarterback coming out. He could be somebody that they could add in behind Geno Smith and maybe learn a little bit. If they want to go a little bit on the younger side, they can go Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. He's probably going to be available on day 2 or day 3. I could see them going somewhere like that. And just in case the Geno Smith situation does not work out, and you don't know how long Geno Smith is going to be a successful quarterback. He is a veteran. He's not super on the old side, but he's definitely getting up there, and he hasn't necessarily wowed you in terms of his ability. You can't really look at Geno Smith and be like, okay, that guy can lead me to a Super Bowl. I just don't believe that. So maybe they go after a guy and maybe hope that he can be groomed into the next franchise quarterback sitting behind Geno Smith. That's a possibility, but I say they go day 3 for that route, where there's going to be some quarterbacks available, but it's not really a super deep class at the quarterback position, as a lot of people have kind of noted over this offseason so far. So we'll have to see what happens with the Raiders. They, as far as what I think their record is going to be, now that they've added Geno Smith and picked up a couple of other little players here and there, I think that the Raiders will be better. I don't think that they're going to be, challenging for the division title or anything like that. But I could see them with Geno Smith and with Pete Carroll as the head coach and maybe retooling that defense a little bit and getting some weapons on the outside and possibly drafting Ashton Genty with their first pick. I could see the Raiders improving for sure, and I could see them getting to possibly about a 7-10 record is what I'm going with right now. That could change, of course, depending on what they do in the draft and the rest of the offseason with free agency and trades and all that. But as of right now, that's kind of where I have them going overall. All of this can change, between now and then. So definitely something to keep in mind as well. So that just about covers it for the season outlook for the Raiders. And when we do come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Denver Broncos. We're going to do the season outlook for them. And there was a lot of moves that they have made over the past few days, and we'll get into that. They're definitely trying to improve that team and build around Bo Nix. So it'll be exciting to see what Bo Nix does in his second year as well. So once we take this quick break, we'll be right back and we will talk more about the Denver Broncos. So just stick with us. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
All right, guys, welcome on back, and we're going to get into our fourth segment of the day, our ongoing season outlook series. This time we're going to be touching on the Denver Broncos. They, of course, made a few moves over the past few days, but before we get into the stuff that they have done so far in free agency, let's just give a quick little review on what happened last year. They finished 10-7, third in the AFC West behind Kansas City and LA, and they got to the wild card round, had to play the second-seeded Buffalo Bills, started the game pretty well with a pretty long, nice touchdown pass from Bo Nix, and got them up to a 7-0 lead. But then Buffalo ended up scoring 31 unanswered points, and they ended the Broncos season 31-7. So they, even though they lost that game, and nobody thought the Broncos were going to beat them, they were heavily outmatched, and the Bills were heavily favored in that game. So not a super big surprise, but that's nothing really to sneeze at, because their offense, or their whole team overall, definitely improved, and they broke their playoff drought that they had prior to that. Since they hadn't been in the playoffs since, I believe it was 2015, back in the Peyton Manning days. That was the last time they tasted the playoffs, but they got there last year with their rookie quarterback, despite the fact that they were still paying Russell Wilson money off of that contract that they signed with Russell Wilson a few years ago. So the Broncos were kind of in a really bad position leading into last year. And funny enough is they actually were rated, I believe it was Pro Football Focus. It was one of those websites. They actually rated the Broncos as the worst roster in all of football last year. And then they end up going 10-7 and making the playoffs. And they had a very good defense too. Defensive Player of the Year, Patrick Surtain on that defense. Nick Bonito was another guy that was considered a candidate for Defensive Player of the Year for a little bit there too. They added a couple of guys too over the past couple of days. Talanoa Hufanga from San Francisco, the safety, so that shores up their safety spot. Dre Greenlaw, also from San Francisco, that helps with their linebacker core. So they've made a lot of moves to shore up an already very good defense, and now they just really need some wide receiver help to go along with Cortland Sutton And with the departure of Javonte Williams, their starting running back from last year, they could look into the draft for a running back. The draft is a good spot for any team that's looking for a running back because it's a very deep class, as we have said many, many times on this show already. So any team that's really looking for, a running back, it's not necessarily the greatest year to be a free agent running back because there's so many options in the draft, and it's going to be a lot cheaper to go get a guy in the draft than it is to sign a guy in free agency. Most likely, a free agent that is worth anything anyway is going to be pretty expensive, and it'll be a lot cheaper and more cost effective to go draft with running back. A lot of guys that the Broncos could go after. Don't believe that Ashton Genty is going to be there when the Broncos select at number 20. I believe he goes a lot earlier than that. There are a couple of other guys out there, though. Of course, Travion Henderson from Ohio State. He could be an option there. Cam Scatabo, another one, could be an option there. Trevor Etienne from Georgia. Not really talked about him a whole lot, but he is an effective running back. He could be there. I wouldn't draft him with the 20th overall pick, but he could be there on day 2 or 3, and you could get him for pretty good value in the 3rd or 4th rounds. So, a lot of options for the Broncos when it comes to running back. That's why I feel like they need to focus more on the wide receiver position. They need to pair somebody along with Courtland Sutton, because Courtland Sutton obviously is a very good receiver, and he showed that he has a pretty good connection with Bo Nix last year that developed over the year, and you saw how improved Bo Nix got as the games wore on, and as we got closer to the playoffs, he started to play his best football of the season. So you want to get a quarterback that looks like it's going to be their franchise quarterback, at least from what we saw last year. They need some receivers on the other end, so definitely could see them going receiver in free agency. I know we talked a little bit when we were talking about the Raiders about some of the available guys that are there at wide receiver. There's, some guys still out there, it's Amari Cooper, he's an option as well to get to the Broncos. Cooper Kupp is another one. I know we mentioned them. We've been mentioning both of those guys a lot lately, but, those are guys that are available. Stephon Diggs, too, as we mentioned before. So, a lot of options available. Not number 1 receivers, but that's not really what the Broncos need. They don't need a number 1 receiver. They just need somebody that can take some pressure off of Courtland Sutton. And then, of course, get a good running back, a solid running game, and put some more pressure or take some more pressure off of Bo Nix as well, and just help him out overall because they've got a lot to build on from last year. Defense is pretty much solid all the way around, from back to front. We've got a good, strong defensive line, stellar linebackers, and then, of course, you got Patrick Surtain and now Hufanga on the back end. All very, very good players. So the defense is pretty much set. Most of the focus needs to go on the offensive side of the ball, and I believe that is what they will do. Take a look at what they did defensively last year just to kind of back up what I'm saying about how good their defense was. They were first in the NFL in sacks, and they were 3rd in the league in points per game. They were top half of the league for the entire year mostly, in points per game allowed. So that defense definitely, helped carry that team to a 10-7 win. Not to say that Bo Nix wasn't a big reason why that they were as good as they were, but, having a defense that good, that can snuff out a lot of really good offenses definitely helps your chances. There were a few games where they really, really, stepped up. One of the games that really stands out to me, even though you can't really look into it too much because the Chiefs were resting most of their players, but the Broncos in that game, that final game of the year that they needed to win in order to, get into the playoffs, you still have to make the plays, whether or not it's, starters or backups or whatever. These are still professional athletes that you're going against. So you need to be able to make the plays. And they really, absolutely destroyed those backups for the Chiefs, but it really showed how good their offense can look when it's clicking, when it's firing on all cylinders. Obviously, if the Chiefs' entire offense was in that game, it's a lot closer than what it ended up being. But if the Broncos can play offense like that, they will be very hard to beat, especially with a defense that is as good as theirs. If they get a couple of big-time players, whether they do it in the draft or through free agency, and they improve that offense, look out, because that offense is only going to get better, especially under Sean Payton, who really does know how to develop a young quarterback and actually cater to what he does best. He didn't get a lot of respect when he was coaching Russell Wilson because mainly he didn't want him there. He wanted his own quarterback. And now that he's got his own quarterback in Bo Nix, you can see just how good Bo Nix could be and how good that Broncos team could be as well. As far as what I think that their record's going to be, I think it could be a very interesting season in the AFC West overall. When you take a look at all of the teams that are in that division, they're all going to be better, every single one of them. Even the Raiders that we talked about in the last segment, every one of those teams is going to be better this coming year. Kansas City, of course, or Kansas City, they're always going to be cream of the crop in that division as long as Mahomes and Andy Reid are in Kansas City. The Chargers are looking to get better. They've added some pieces on their offense and on their defense, shored up some of their running game issues. And the Broncos, they, of course, made a lot of moves defensively, and now I expect a lot of their attention to focus on offense, and I think they're going to be better as well. I think their overall record might end up being pretty similar to what it was last year. Maybe one more win, like I would say 10-7, 11-6, something like that. But that record may not seem like I'm saying they're going to be better, but it is very possible that you can end up having the same record that you had the previous season and still be a better overall team, because a lot of factors play into each and every season. Who you play, how much rest you have when you play that team. With the NFL's crazy scheduling, there's a lot of games in between games where you don't get a ton of rest. So a lot of those kind of factors play into account, as well as, of course, injuries are a big part of the game, as we all know. But a lot of different factors could go into it, but I could see them like a 10-7, 11-6. I could even see them being better than that and possibly even challenging for the AFC West. With the defense as good as their defense was last year and how much better it is already getting, you can't overlook the Broncos in that division, especially if Bo Nix takes that second-year jump that a lot of fans and, of course, the Broncos coaches are hoping that he will take. If he's even better than he was the later part of this past year, then obviously that's going to make the Broncos better too. And they already have a stellar number one receiver in Cortland Sutton. So if they add a couple pieces alongside him to have some depth, maybe get a tight end as well. There's a couple of guys that they could go after in the draft. It's a very deep tight end class as well. Don't believe that Warren out of Penn State will be available when the Broncos pick, but if he is, that could be an option that they could go. It could be a route they go for sure. But 10-7, 11-6, I think that's a pretty fair estimation of what their record is going to be this coming year. So that covers it for the entire AFC. So the next time we do these season outlooks, we're going to be diving into the NFC, and we're going to start in the NFC North and kind of work our way that way. A lot of stories in the NFC that are pretty interesting, and definitely wanted to get into the NFC North because of a lot of moves that the Chicago Bears have made, and just that division as a whole has been pretty busy overall in free agency. So there'll be a lot of things to talk about with those two teams. But either way, when we come back, we're going to take one final break. So when we come back, we're going to talk about what I believe the handful of teams that I've looked at and I could kind of see that they may be losing in free agency a little bit. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be bad teams next year or anything, but just some of the decisions or non-decisions that have happened are a little bit questionable. So we're going to get into some of those teams and all of that when we come right back. So just stick with me, and we'll be right back right after this. All right, guys, welcome on back to the final segment of our show. We're going to be talking about the top teams, just a handful of teams that I came up with that I believe are losing in free agency currently. And now keep in mind, this could change. It's still very early. We're only 2 days in with the tampering period and everything. Free agency officially starts tomorrow at 4 o'clock when the league year starts. So a lot of things can change between now and then. So these teams may be on my list right now, but they may end up bouncing back as we go through this offseason. So just keep that in mind. But teams that I think that are losing in free agency, the first team that I wanted to mention was the Tennessee Titans. Now, they, of course, have the number 1 overall pick. So their fortunes could change come draft time. But as it stands right now, I had them as one of the losers of free agency so far, mainly because of the contract that they gave to left tackle Dan Moore, free agent left tackle from Pittsburgh, coming over and signing a 4-year, $82 million deal. And I don't like that deal just simply because, I'm, of course, as everybody knows at this point, I'm a Steelers fan. And I remember the issues the Steelers had on offense, along that offensive line over the past few years, basically the entire time that Dan Moore was there. He had a couple of solid performances, so he definitely has that in him for sure. But he's not a swing tackle. He's not a guy that can play either side. He can only play left tackle. So if there's any injuries and maybe the Titans would have to shift around their offensive line, they're not going to be able to do that because he simply cannot play multiple, tackle positions on that offensive line. But that's not a super, super big thing. That just comes into play whenever, you have injuries and you're kind of desperate. But he was never able to move to the other side of the line. And he got beat a lot. He was not great in pass protection. He had a few, games where he played pretty well. He actually had a pretty decent record against Myles Garrett whenever they played. But towards the latter end of his career in Pittsburgh, he was getting eaten up by Myles Garrett whenever they would play against each other. And he was just a liability on that offensive line, one of the liabilities on that offensive line. And I don't think he had a particularly good year last year. And that's part of the reason why the Steelers have been looking at tackles in the draft over the past couple years. They drafted Broderick Jones a couple years ago with their first overall pick with the intent that he was going to take over that position. Didn't work out, and Broderick ended up playing on the right side where he is not comfortable, which is a whole other story. But then it was Dan Moore and Broderick Jones, and that was not a good offensive line, not to protect the blind side or anything like that. And then they draft last year with their first overall pick. They draft, offensive tackle as well, Troy Fautano from Washington. And he ends up getting hurt in one of the first games that he plays in last year. So they have to throw Dan Moore back out there along with Broderick Jones in that same, rotation. And it just didn't ever really work out. So the Titans signing him to a massive, massive deal like that is just head scratching to me. Like, they could have went out and they could have gotten Ronnie Stanley. He was still a free agent at the time of that signing, and he ended up re-signing with the Ravens, and for a much cheaper deal. You could have got a better offensive lineman who has more experience, has experience playing better for longer than Dan Moore, and you could have gotten him a lot cheaper than what you got Dan Moore. It was a horrible overpayment, I think, for the Titans, and that is why they're one of the teams that are on my list as one of the teams that are losing in free agency so far. Another team is the Texans, and this is mainly they've made a couple moves that are pretty good moves, but this is mainly because of another offensive line decision, this case in which the Texans made, and that was to trade their best offensive lineman and left tackle, Laramie Tunsil. He goes over to Washington in the trade, and it's just head-scratching just because last year they had so many issues trying to, protect C.J. Stroud, and they weren't really able to do a good job of that. But Laramie Tunsil was their best player on offense, on the offensive line anyway, and to just get rid of him, in a class that's not necessarily a super great offensive line class, not like it has been in the past years. It just doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. I mean, they, of course, made the big move getting C.J. Gardner-Johnson, for their secondary, but their defense was already pretty decent overall. They, of course, getting C.J. Gardner-Johnson makes them better, and it's a good move overall, on face value. But they could have used that money differently, in a different way to where they could try and actually focus on building that offensive line so you can get C.J. Stroud back to where he was when he was a rookie, when he was putting up pretty big numbers and, was the talk of the NFL for most of the season in his rookie year. So they could have went back that route, but they didn't do that. They decided to get Laramie Tunsil out of there, and now I'm not sure what they're going to do on offense or on the offensive line. We'll just have to see, maybe, because there's not really anybody out there that I think is better than Laramie Tunsil at that position. So, not really sure what they were really doing there. That was kind of head scratching to me. I just don't get it, but they did it. So that's another hole that they need to fill in this offseason. Another team might surprise some people that I put them on here, but that is the Philadelphia Eagles. I think so far they have not really been active in free agency. That's why they're on here as a loser in free agency. Hard to release. I'm not saying, like I said before, I'm not saying that either of these teams that I've mentioned here on this list, I'm not saying that any of these teams are going to be bad this year. Obviously, the Eagles are one of the best teams in the league. They certainly were the best team in the league last year. But at the same time, what can also still be true is they have lost a lot of guys on defense, a lot of key players on defense. Take a look at Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, two big guys on the defensive line that really created how big and tough their defensive line in the trenches just overall is for the Philadelphia Eagles. They lost two, big name guys there. So those are definitely going to be holes that they need to fix. But it's definitely helpful that we're in a draft class that has so many defensive line players available. So they could shore up that defensive line. I know they have an affinity for Georgia players on that defense. So maybe they dip into that pool, or maybe they go a couple of other different guys. They could make some trade up to try and get a couple of guys. There's a lot of guys available on the defensive line. So they could, retool that, and they could end up being, just as good, if not better for it. Only time will tell. But also losing C.J. Gardner-Johnson, that's hurtful to their secondary. They still have their good young corners in Quinyon Mitchell and then, of course, Cooper DeJean. Both guys flashed really big potential in their rookie seasons. So maybe they thought that was enough for them to feel comfortable to make a trade like that. But C.J. Gardner-Johnson is still a very, very good defensive back. So losing him is definitely going to hurt them overall. But that's the Eagles. And the other team that I have, the last team that I have on this list, is the Dallas Cowboys, and that is mainly because of their lack of movement. They have shown, or Jerry Jones has come out, and he has said plenty of times that they're trying to go all in. He said that last year they were trying to go all in. They didn't do much last year in free agency either, and then, of course, they end up just having an absolutely disastrous season. And then this year so far, the two moves that they have made is they're signing Javonte Williams, a running back out of Denver, who was kind of underwhelming for Denver last year. They're signing him to a deal, and they also re-signed Kevondre Turpin, their wide receiver / kick returner. But those are really the only moves that they have made, and I know a lot of Cowboys fans are probably frustrated with the direction or lack thereof of this team right now. This just seems like last year, when you take a look at what they could have done, they could have signed Derrick Henry, decided not to do that, and then Derrick Henry goes to Baltimore, and then Jerry Jones says that they didn't get him because they couldn't afford him, which was just not true. They could have gotten him if they really wanted him. And now, when it's such a deep running back draft class, instead of going into the draft and getting a guy like an Ashton Genty or something like that, you go and you sign Javonte Williams. Now, if they still end up drafting a running back in the first round or early on, then this could be just, completely moot in terms of the running back position. But they still need other pieces, around Dak Prescott, because Dak, for all of the crap that he gets, he still is a good quarterback. But he doesn't really have a ton of weapons right now around him. He's got CeeDee Lamb, of course, who's one of the best receivers in the league, but there's not much really behind him, and they really need to get some depth in that wide receiver room to help Dak out. And obviously Dak needs to stay healthy himself. That's another issue that the Cowboys have. But the Cowboys are just not really doing much, and they really need to start actually making some calls and start making some moves to try and improve this team. Otherwise, it's, there's a fear, I'm sure, in Dallas Cowboys fandom that you could be seeing a pretty similar year that you got last year, maybe a little bit better because of injuries and whatnot. So they could, squeak out to like 10 wins or something like that. I could see that happening. But the other thing that they didn't do, and this isn't necessarily free agency wise, but the Brian Schottenheimer head coach hire, it doesn't move the needle for you, if you're a Cowboys fan. It's just another guy that just seemingly is a yes man for Jerry Jones. I honestly would have just had them keep Mike McCarthy, have him come back. That's what I would have done if you're going to go get a guy like Brian Schottenheimer who, hasn't really been, let's just say he's not on the top of a lot of people's list to be their next head coach. So this is just a move that is just another guy that's not going to fight Jerry. And Jerry Jones is ultimately the head coach of that team. He's in control of everything. He is more public than any other owner in the NFL, talks to the media way more than any other team, So he's essentially the de facto head coach. Anything that goes roster-wise has to go through him. So I have the Cowboys there as, being one of the losers in free agency. Another one I just wanted to quickly just add in there here as we close out the show. Just another team that I was thinking about as an honorable mention for being one of the losing teams. And it might surprise some people, but I say Seattle as well. Getting rid of two of their best weapons in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And then, of course, getting rid of Geno Smith. And then signing Sam Darnold for a very big contract. I just don't think that was a smart move on the Seahawks' part, just because there's not really anything that Sam Darnold has to work with. There's nobody really to throw to except for Jackson Smith and Jigba, who is, admittedly a decent wide receiver. But, Sam Darnold, a lot of the issues or a lot of the reasons why he was as good as he was last year was the talent that he had around him. Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, two very, very good, wide receivers. So, and you saw those last two games, he kind of just fell back into those old Sam Darnold ways, and that's a fear, of course. It's just a 1 year sample size of when he was good, surrounded by really, really good talent, and he doesn't have that in Seattle. So we'll have to see what happens in Seattle, if they add some more pieces and make that situation a little bit better. But as of right now, I have them just as sort of like an honorable mention as one of the losers in free agency. But so that covers it for this show. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is my first live show, so I hope everything went pretty smoothly. I hope there was no real issues that maybe stood out to you guys as you were watching. But I do appreciate everybody for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. We are, of course, always presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support, as always, of course, means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on all the social media accounts, Facebook, X, TikTok, Instagram, all of those things. And thank you once again, guys, and have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to